everyone. Welcome back to English 221. This is for our class for Wednesday, the 10th of May. Believe it or not, this is our last class before, of course, the final examination. So, in terms of due dates, and you can see this in the notes below, all the way at the ending. So, this would be in section 10. Paper number 2, that's going to be due up until, or will be accepted up until the day of the final examination. So that's the 15th, that's this upcoming Monday, though certainly you can hand in the paper early. And you would need to hand that in by 8 a.m. on Monday. No, not at 11:59 p.m. because you're going to be busy on Monday. And that will be via PDF as usual to my email, Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, @gcc.mass.edu. Because on Monday the 15th at 8 a.m. is when I am posting our final examination. So if we were meeting in person, this would be the scheduled time for the final. And we would have approximately 2 hours to take that final exam. But since we are meeting online, so to speak, you will have 24 hours to take that final and to return it to me. So it will be posted on the 15th, Monday at 8 a.m. It'll be due 24 hours later, Tuesday, the 16th at 8 a.m. Of course, via PDF to my email, Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, @gcc.mass.edu. The exam is open book and open notes so that you can reference class materials, and it'll be a series of essay questions and also a selection of some quotes asking you to analyze how those quotes are important within the play itself. We use the term explicate to explain in depth or detail about those particular pieces of usually poetry, but you can also explicate a short passage of prose. And the exam will have choice within it, and it should be a way for you to basically synthesize everything that we've talked about over the course of the semester. And I certainly don't expect your responses to be as neat or as polished or well developed as what you would do with the paper. After all, you don't have 2 weeks to work on this final exam. You've got basically 24 hours to work on this exam. But what I hope that you can do is see this exam as a kind of learning exercise where you can put together all the pieces of what we've been talking about over the course of the semester. And of course, we're ending, or almost ending, with Othello. There are other plays, obviously, that Shakespeare has written, and there are also other genres, specifically the genre of tragic comedy. And we've talked a little bit about Shakespeare's sonnets, his poetry. We talked a little bit about his comedies. We talked a little bit about his histories. We talked a little bit and are talking about his tragedies. And the last genre would be tragic comedies. And what scholars believe is that those tragic comedies were written towards the ending of Shakespeare's career. And one play in particular, it's entitled The Tempest, is thought to be the very last play Shakespeare wrote before his retirement. And if we had a few more weeks, well, we could cover The Tempest in depth. We don't, which is why I had assigned it as an extra credit. So, a couple of options for extra credit. I will put an extra credit a question on the final exam about The Tempest. So it would be possible for you actually to earn over 100 points on the exam. So if you wanted to tackle that, certainly you could do that. And also if you wanted to submit in one other journal, in addition to Othello, the journal for The Tempest, you could earn a little bit of extra credit as well. The journal for the journal for Othello, you can hand in at any point up until the start of the final examination. So I know some of you have already submitted it. Thank you very much for that last journal, so to speak, on Othello, because again, you're not required to do a journal on The Tempest, though you might want to do so for a little bit of extra credit. But for those of you who want a little bit of extra time, you've got up until the final exam. And the reason why is because this class might help to inform some of your ideas for that journal. And of course, that journal might also help assist you if you're thinking about writing your paper about Othello. The second paper should be either about the history play, that would be Richard II, or one of the tragedies, that would be Macbeth or Othello. Since your first paper was either about the sonnet or for the comedy. And in terms of thinking about The Tempest, we've been talking about production all semester long. And this is actually at the ending, again, of our notes. This would be section 8, where it talks about that The Tempest is a tragic comedy. And what a tragic comedy means is that Shakespeare used elements of tragedy. So there's a darkness there that you wouldn't expect necessarily in your typical comedy, but also used comedic elements, which meant the happy ending and the promise of marriage and lots of music and dance. And the performance, if you care to watch it, is a adaptation that HBO actually put together of many of Shakespeare's plays, entitled Shakespeare's Animated Tales. And what they would do in approximately 25 minutes or so is give an animated version of Shakespeare's tales. They were directed towards children, though some of the stories, for instance Macbeth, are pretty darn dark. But nevertheless, if you are curious, they have a animated tale for The Tempest, and I have included the link for that in the notes below under the 8th section. It's 25 minutes long. Obviously, quite a bit was condensed, but still you can get an overall sense of the plot, which I've always argued has been the biggest challenge with Shakespeare, is trying to understand the language, and that if children were introduced to the plots early on, then they wouldn't necessarily have the kind of anxiety about Shakespeare that Shakespeare oftentimes brings to older students when they have to read Shakespeare and they spend their time trying to tackle understanding rather than appreciating it thematically. And what my hope is that at this point in the semester, you are spending less time in trying to figure out what is happening, and you're able to appreciate why those things are happening. And of course, the more you read Shakespeare and watch performance, the better off you are in terms of not just knowing about that particular play, but also just being comfortable with Renaissance language, which I had likened to a foreign language at the beginning of the semester, but one we know perhaps 90% of, and maybe now you could say that you know maybe 91% of after these 16 weeks or so with being exposed to Renaissance English. So, going back to Othello, our very last play, our last class, we had a guest speaker, so to speak. That would have been from a noted Shakespearean scholar from Harvard, which is why I wanted you to see that. And in fact, there are quite a few of her lectures online. So in addition to plays, in addition to Othello, other plays as well. But I thought you might want to see some of her perspectives on Othello. But before I talk about those, you'll see that at the very beginning of our notes, there's just some general introduction to Othello. And as I had indicated before, Othello has many parallels with Much Ado About Nothing, but it has a very tragic ending, and it's much, much darker. Iago has been named, or at least oftentimes identified, as Shakespeare's most consummate villain. And I think that's true. You know, his ability to manipulate and control is really unmatched. And his motivation is something that many people speculate about. And there are some reasons that we'll talk about. But ultimately, it seems that he enjoys the sport of the thing. We had talked about that a little bit with Don John in Much Ado About Nothing, who also seemed to enjoy the sport of evil. Many have identified Othello as Shakespeare's most disturbing tragedy. Certainly, as many of you indicated, Macbeth is quite disturbing. But perhaps Othello is more so because it is a play about the bedroom, not the stateroom. So this is very personal. We're no longer talking about kings or queens. This is very contemporary. Some of the issues of racism, sexism, and domestic violence. And as we saw with Dear Mr. Shakespeare, there was a reference to the idea of a Moor. And the definition of a Moor, which you can see in the notes below, a member of the northwestern African Muslim people of mixed Berber and Arab descent. In other words, someone with black skin. And as you know, both from watching Dear Mr. Shakespeare, but also from some of the discussion forum responses, that past performances had cast Caucasian actors as Othello. And I have included some clips if you wanted to watch. You don't necessarily have to, but I encourage you to do that. Laurence Olivier, a very noted Shakespearean actor, performed Othello in 1965. That was usually considered to be the definitive version of Othello. Yes, in blackface. Orson Welles. That's a name that you might recognize, Orson Welles. He's known for Citizen Kane, a very important film that I talk about in my film and literature class, and also for things like War of the Worlds, a radio broadcast that I talk about in my media and popular culture class that led to basically mass hysteria, where people thought that the broadcast was real, that ultimately Martians were invading the planet Earth, and people responded so drastically to that some even committed suicide, preferring that over the option of perhaps being captured by a Martian. So obviously this was in the glory days of radio before television. But going back to Othello, Anthony Hopkins, an actor who's still with us, very noted, known for Silence of the Lambs. It's a movie I discussed, though we don't necessarily watch in my horror film class, was Othello in the BBC version of Othello in 1981. And again, if you look at the notes below, you can see the videos for all of these. And again, all of these clips are just 1 or 2 or 3 minutes long. And while he's not in blackface in the way that Laurence Olivier was in blackface, obviously what you can see is we've got a darker Anthony Hopkins who actually progressively gets darker as the play progresses. So one of the things that I think is more interesting about Othello are the contemporary performances that are casting actual black actors. So not at all surprising that the Shakespeare's Globe Theater, which Dear Mr. Shakespeare had referenced, cast a black actor as Othello in 2008, and you can see a 1-minute clip of that. Kenneth Branagh, who we've talked about previously with Much Ado About Nothing, also cast a black Othello. Lawrence Fishburne, if you're familiar with that Hollywood actor. And Kenneth Branagh gave himself the role of Iago. And in some ways, it was brilliant. Not only is it, of course, historically accurate that a black actor should play Othello, but if you really want to sink your teeth into a role, it's probably playing a villain. And that is indeed what Iago is, the consummate villain. You might know James Earl Jones. He has an incredible booming voice. And in 2009, he presented during an evening of poetry and music and the spoken word to the White House, the Obama administration, and he actually read a passage from Othello. And that was in 2009. That's 6 minutes long if you wanted to see that. But going back to the Harvard presentation of Othello, that's section 2 of our notes below, is certainly Othello's about race. People are oftentimes surprised, as many of you indicated in your discussion forum comments, how incredibly rich this play is with some of the social issues that we deal with in our time. Obviously, it's not just about race, it's also about women's rights, and that makes the play very progressive as well. Keep in mind that Dear Mr. Othello, as I indicated, or Dear Mr. Shakespeare, as I indicated in some of the discussion comments, while initially it raises the question of could Shakespeare have been racist himself because of some of the racist language he used, the important part, and you want to rewatch this if you didn't get this with Dear Mr. Shakespeare, is that Shakespeare subverts that. He shows us how wrong these characterizations are, so that in the end, the hero, the person that we are identifying with, is Othello, not Iago. So keep that in mind. Obviously, the play is about love, and actually multiple forms of love. One of the conjectures that have been raised about Iago and Othello is that Iago might have some sexual jealousy, and would really prefer to be with Othello, and sees Desdemona as competition. That might be a little bit of a stretch, but certainly there does, within the play itself, illustrate how love leads to jealousy. So even if it's not erotic love, it could certainly be the connection of a strong relationship between two people. Though, of course, we see at the very start of the play that this honest Iago, which is rather ironic because he's anything but honest. So one wonders, how did he gain that reputation? And one assumes that prior to that, he had fooled everybody that he was honest. But we learn almost immediately how racist he is. The question is, was he always that way? Or was he merely that way after Othello's marriage? And if so, is his marriage to Desdemona the impetus for his desire to seek evil against Othello? Order and chaos, definitely a theme in the play. Honesty and falsity, self-knowledge, class, nation and place, as we saw in the Harvard presentation. Honor, reputation. Reputation is such a huge thematic issue that we've seen in so many of Shakespearean plays. Othello's insecurity, which is why he's so easily manipulated. Women's rights, and there are some rather progressive speeches that I wanted to talk about. Lots of animal imagery in this play to illustrate the bestial, and dark and light imagery as well. And of course, reading a play is different than watching a performance. I didn't have us watch a performance. I had us listen to a performance. So in some ways, it was sort of the mid-ground between just reading or just watching a performance. It was a little bit of both. And the Archangel versions of Shakespearean plays are usually considered to be the gold standard, and all the Shakespearean plays are available in audio in that format. One of the things that was barely discussed in the Harvard presentation was what was known as the marriage scene that occurs in Act 3, Scene 3. Remember the pyramid structure of Shakespearean play? So the third act would be the top of the pyramid, the point. That would be the height of conflict. This is where Iago basically convinces Othello that Othello needs to seek revenge against Desdemona because she's been unfaithful. And they're both kneeling at one point, and some scholars have argued it's almost like a kind of marriage ceremony between Iago and Othello, especially if you wanted to support the argument of some sort of homoerotic tension, at least on Iago's part, towards Othello, and that's his motivation for his jealousy. But I always think of a very contemporary play in terms of perhaps understanding what's happening with Othello. And I mentioned this in some of the discussion forum responses too. It's a play entitled A Raisin in the Sun by Lorraine Hansberry. I highly recommend it. It was written in the 1950s in the United States. And it's about a black family who moves into an all-white neighborhood and some of the pushback that they receive because of that. There are other things going on in the play as well. But I always think of one of the lines in that play when the family, the black family, is talking amongst themselves and trying to understand why there's so much opposition to them moving into this all-Caucasian neighborhood. And I think what's very telling is when one of the characters asks, "Well, what are they afraid of? That we're going to eat them?" And another family member, another black family member says, "No, they're not afraid we're going to eat them. They're afraid we're going to marry them." And that ultimately is the underlying fear of racism, is intermarriage and the mixing of bloodlines. And certainly we see that at the beginning of the play, Othello is honored and revered, at least up to the point for his military prowess. But once he crosses that line, so to speak, and dares to marry the fair Desdemona, everything changes. Of course, that's not to say that this was hidden racism that existed under the surface. If you're a horror film fan, do watch Get Out by Jordan Peele. And Jordan Peele likes to expose the ugly underbelly of racism, that what appears on the surface is really merely hiding a much darker reality. And one could say that that was also the case with Othello, that even though he appeared to be accepted and honored, perhaps deep down inside, he wasn't. But we do know that once he takes action and he marries Desdemona, the game changes considerably for him. Many of you pointed out to how surprised you were by how vulgar the language is. And Roderigo begins in Act 1, Scene 1, line 66, calling Othello the thick-lipped one. Iago continues in Act 1, Scene 1, line 116, talking about Othello as an old black ram who's tupping a white ewe. White ewe, of course, would be Desdemona. And in Act 1, Scene 1, line 88, talking about Othello and Desdemona making the beast with two backs, talking about their sexual union and the consummation of their marriage. Note all the prose passages. Iago is definitely representative of the bestial, the ugly, and the racism that exists in society. Brabantio, Act 1, Scene 2, line 70, even talks about Othello's sooty bosom. Now, as we continue on talking about Othello, one of the things that I wanted to draw your attention to is how the truth is twisted against Othello. And in some ways very similar to Macbeth, that the witches gave the literal truth, but it was a twisted truth. Think, for instance, in Act 1, Scene 3, line 292, when Brabantio says that Desdemona deceived her father and may deceive thee, being Othello. Of course, that haunts him. And there is truth to that. She did deceive her father. A theme we've seen throughout the semester about a daughter being viewed as property, and the daughter taking initiative to choose her own mate would be considered quite unusual for the time. Iago follows up on this in Act 3, Scene 2, line 206, saying that she, Desdemona, did deceive her father, marrying you. Of course, the truth is what eats away at Othello. Iago, this honest, supposedly Iago, is a master manipulator of weaknesses and has a master understanding of psychology, knowing that Cassio's weakness is drunkenness. So basically, he can destroy Cassio's reputation by getting Cassio drunk and knowing that he's going to act in an inappropriate way. Roderigo's weakness is lust. He wants Desdemona, so this not only allows Iago to manipulate Roderigo, but also earn some profit. So he earns some money as well off of this. Very clever, Iago. Of course, Othello's weakness is his insecurity, by being considered as other in society. And as Othello admits, he doesn't have much experience with romance. He's a soldier. Amelia's weakness is that she wants to please her husband, Iago. She wants him to be happy. So when he asks for the handkerchief, she gladly complies without even asking why. And one would think that Amelia probably knows Iago better than anybody else. And yet, she doesn't stop to think, what kind of evil could he commit with this? So Iago's motivations. At one point, he says sport and profit. And I think that's quite true. Much like I had earlier referenced the idea of Don John and him enjoying sport and profit. Cassio received a promotion instead of Iago. Iago has the experience, but Cassio has the book learning. So this eats at Iago. Of course, Roderigo has money, and Iago can get a nice amount of profit off of this. And it's mentioned only once that Amelia was rumored to have an affair with Othello the Moor. It's never followed up upon, so we don't know what the story is. We assume it's not true because there isn't any evidence in the play to show that it's true. Women's rights, and if you're still looking for a paper topic, this might be something that you might want to examine, is the way that women are presented in the play, especially when you've got speeches like Amelia's in Act 3, Scene 4, line 103, when Amelia talks about the men are like stomachs and they consume women. Or Desdemona in Act 4, Scene 3, line 86, that it's their husbands' faults if wives do fall. Very progressive idea. We do know that women are treated horribly in this play. Iago treats Emilia terribly. Ultimately, he kills her. Othello treats Desdemona horribly. Ultimately, he kills her. Cassio treats Bianca horribly. And thinking about these women, are women like Emilia and Desdemona strong because they have statements where they talk about men's failings, or because they basically stand by their partners? Or are they weak for doing that, standing by their partners when their partners are so obviously wrong? Or perhaps a bit of both. And again, the contemporary parallel of domestic violence does not escape me. Maybe Othello's best known for perhaps the most important prop in theater history, the handkerchief. It all rests on that handkerchief. Without that handkerchief, there is no physical proof. And without that physical proof, everything falls apart. So, Othello, at the ending of the play, and we know that Othello was a good man and also was a great man. He had distinguished himself in battle. I don't know if we can say that Macbeth was a good man, but certainly he distinguished himself in battle. We know that Othello experienced downfall, and we know that Macbeth experienced downfall. We know that outside forces could be seen in play. For Macbeth, that could be the witches, or perhaps Lady Macbeth, or both. For Othello, perhaps it's Iago. We know that for the definition of tragedy and tragic hero, the tragic hero should accept responsibility. And this is very difficult to find in Macbeth, with Macbeth accepting responsibility. In fact, he has become a kind of killing machine. I had a former professor of mine in college call him that, where he is basically numb to the idea that his dearest partner in greatness, his wife, has now died of suicide. Maybe we can say that Othello takes some responsibility. And he says, remember, I've done the state some service, and they know it in Act 5, Scene 2, line 339. Whether or not that's his focus on his former glory, or whether this is just a rationalization for why he should be held accountable. So it's complex as to whether or not we can say that he accepts responsibility. Just like with Richard II. When Richard II is finally alone and decides that I've wasted time and time doth waste me, is that enough to say that he's taken responsibility, or is it merely still an element of self-indulgent pity? We know that ultimately Othello commits suicide, and certainly from the Greek tradition of tragedy and tragic hero, that would be considered cowardice. So that would not be taking responsibility. But of course, we know that this is a different time and place than 430 BC Greece, and Shakespeare likes to complicate matters. So, in fact, this will be our attendance question, our last attendance question, which will be due on Friday the 12th at 8 a.m. Do you think Othello could be considered a tragic hero? And why or why not? Being a great man who experiences downfall because of outside forces, but also flaws in character, and then this person accepts responsibility for their role, and we feel pity and fear. Pity because this was a good person, and fear because if they could experience this downfall, so could we. And as usual, the questions I ask don't necessarily have right or wrong answers. I'm more interested in the thought process that goes into it. And you're not required to respond to your classmates, but you are required to read your classmates' responses and my responses in turn. That's a wonderful way, too, to prepare for the final examination, is just to review all of the discussion questions from yourself and your classmates over the course of the semester. So, where that leaves us with, as I had indicated, The Tempest. If you so wanted to, again, you're not required to, but if you're interested in earning a little bit of extra credit, you might be motivated to watch the HBO Animated Tales version of The Tempest. Obviously, it's been simplified. This is a 25-minute animated adaptation of a Shakespearean play, and as we know, Shakespearean plays can take anywhere from 2 to 4 hours to perform. So we're not getting the play in its entirety, but at least you'll get an idea of the plot. Tempest being a major storm. And one of the reasons why this play is considered important, The Tempest, is because it's viewed as Shakespeare's swan song, his goodbye to his audience before he retires. So the main character, Prospero, basically is controlling and manipulating everything. And then at the ending of the play, he says that he's going to abandon magic. And this might be similar to Shakespeare, controlling, manipulating everything, and then at the ending saying that he's going to abandon his artistry, his the magic of theater, so to speak. So there is a brief farewell message from a friend of mine, and this is in the 9th section of our notes. It's approximately a minute or so long that you might want to watch. And again, due dates, 5:15 Monday, 8 a.m. That's for paper number 2. And by that point, it should also be where you have handed in the Othello journal if you haven't already done so. And the final exam will be posted on the 15th, Monday, 8 a.m., due 24 hours later, Tuesday the 16th at 8 a.m. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on with one last class, our final examination. Take care. Bye-bye.